So tonight, I want to, shifting gears, but only ever so slightly, I want to talk about the way that we as Western evangelicals address these conversations about sex and virginity and purity. And I know that this conference is about porn specifically, but I think in order to have that conversation, we need to kind of pan out a little bit and talk about how we've been taught to think about these things in general, right? So my interest in how we talk about sex as evangelicals started a few weeks before my senior year at Biola. I'm a Biola grad. Jeff and I are both grads from the Communications Studies Department, best major on campus. So it was a few weeks before my senior year started when I got a phone call, the kind of phone call you never want to get from someone that you love. It was one of my best friends who was about to become my roommate in the house that I lived in senior year, calling to tell me that while she was on vacation that summer, she had been sexually assaulted. Fast forward a few weeks, and we're all back in La Mirada, 21 years old and wildly ill-equipped to love and support our friend in the way that she needed as she was healing from her sexual assault. And I'll never forget, an afternoon, pretty soon after classes had started, I was sitting in my room, probably being really studious and like getting ahead on my reading, when I heard her walk in the house, and I heard her walk down the hallway to my room, and she flung the door open and threw herself on the floor, weeping, saying over and over again, "He took my purity. He took my purity." Not only was she dealing with the aftermath of a sexual assault, but because of the ways that she'd been taught to view purity and virginity, she was convinced that because this man had forced himself on her, that she was no longer pure. And as I sat there, completely bewildered and heartbroken, I felt this thing rise up in my chest that, looking back, I could only attest to the Holy Spirit because I had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, no. No, he did not. Your purity was secured on the cross of Christ, and no one can take that from you. The reason I tell you the story is that it was a pivotal moment for me and for my community as we started to wrestle with the language and the logic we had been given to talk about and understand sex. Now hear me on this before we go any further. I very much believe that sex is a good and sacred thing that is designed for the context of marriage. Talbot student, it's fine. They're allowed to take correct. Don't like run off your Bible professors and be like, "That's Sarah Schwartz." What I started, so yes, I very much believe that. What I started to wrestle with was the way we had been taught to think about it. Because according to the framework I had been given, or at least picked up sort of along the way, to understand sexuality and virginity, I understood how she arrived at that conclusion, even though I knew it wasn't true. And those of us who have grown up in youth group or whatever have all heard the purity talks at one time or another, right? Right?
Yeah.
Pretty horrifying moments of our adolescence, I know. Author Sarah Bessey, summarizing what she heard growing up in church as someone who had had sex before she got married, writes this: "Over the years, the messages melded together into the common refrain, your virginity was a gift and you gave it away. You threw away your virtue for a moment of pleasure. You have twisted God's ideal of sex and love and marriage. You will never be free of your former partners. The boys of your past will haunt your marriage like soul ties. Your virginity belonged to your future husband, and you stole it from him. If you ever get married, you'll have tremendous baggage to overcome in your marriage. You've ruined everything. No one honorable or godly wants to marry you. You are damaged goods." But what about victims of assault, like my friends, who were a part of something that they did not agree to? 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men, and that's real conservative estimates, will be victims of sexual assault in their lifetime. Think about that for a second. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men. Is that what we're saying about them? That they're somehow broken or damaged or dirty? And more importantly, is that what they're hearing when they come to our churches to hear this super great news about Jesus? Maybe some of you remember Elizabeth Smart. She was a Mormon girl who was kidnapped out of Salt Lake City in 2002, and she was held captive for close to a year by her abductor and regularly sexually assaulted by him. And she grew up in a Mormon context, hearing many of the same messages that you and I grew up hearing. And she wrote this: "For me, I thought, I'm that chewed up piece of gum. Nobody rechews a piece of gum, you throw it away. And that's how easy it is to feel you no longer have worth. You no longer have value." And then I got to thinking, well, what about the widow or the widower who loses their spouse and then they get remarried? Like, I've never heard anyone say, like, ew, that person's disgusting, because they've had sex with someone else before their current spouse. But that's what purity logic would lead me to think, or would seem to imply, right? Or what about people who just mess up? Who've crossed lines in their relationships, who wrestle with porn? Is it true that they've fallen into this one weird thing that the cross can't like fully recover or redeem or make new? So, you know, like a real super light, fun way for me to start my senior year, wrestling through all these things. So I started reading anything I could get my hands on and talking to anyone who would listen to me. And I came across an article out of the School of Psychology at Seattle Pacific University called "Naked and Ashamed: Evangelical Purity Culture." And I learned that while for the majority of church history, the church has taught that sex is designed for marriage, these weird metaphors that you and I grew up hearing are relatively modern. The author writes, "One of the more recent attempts to understand the Christian body that is the purity movement, a Christian cultural trend that focuses on sexual abstinence and that has gained popularity within the last 2 decades." So essentially, our lifetimes. "The movement began with the transitional period following the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution was a time in which the culture began to question and expand the bounds of sexual promiscuity and morality, in which women were liberated to join men in being promiscuous." Which that's hilarious to me, because I'm like, okay, if men were already being promiscuous, like who were they being promiscuous with? But that's a totally logic. That's another story for another time. The culture embraced sexual freedom during this period, but not for long. In the 80s and 90s, a decline in the economy, as well as the onset of AIDS, caused a cultural shift back towards sexual conservatism. And it was in this shift that the purity movement was born. So it was teens in the 90s that first started hearing these analogies about how having sex before marriage was like taking a lick from a lollipop or a bite from an apple, or something about Scotch tape that none of us really understood, but were super freaked out by anyway. And while the movement was well-intended, it was largely a reaction to the 60s and 70s. It was a reaction out of fear, because it is easier to motivate large groups of people using fear and shame than it is to engage with holistic conversations about Christian sexual ethics. The evangelical right sensed a generation embracing the sexual values of the sexual revolution and countered with what we now know as the purity movement. Author Elizabeth Esther writes this: "I understand why we do this. Christians are alarmed by what we see as a sexually permissive society. This scares us. The less sacred sex becomes to the broader culture, the more sacred we insist on making it among fellow Christians. The intention might be good, but overemphasizing the specialness of virginity has unintended harmful consequences. We start by making ridiculous these promises to our daughters. We tell them that sexual purity is a guarantee of a more intimate married sex life. We tell them that if they lose their purity, they will never really get it back. Oh yes, they can be forgiven, but they're damaged goods." And here I think it's important to make a note that we tend, generally speaking, to approach men and women differently when we talk about sex and virginity, right? Donna Freitas, who wrote a book called Sex and the Soul, writes about her conversations with young Christians and says this: Many young evangelical men spoke about expecting this gift of virginity from their future wives and how they would find it hard to marry a girl who hadn't saved it for them. But concerns about being a virgin gift fell disproportionately on the women. Only once did a young man describe his virginity or purity as a gift for his future wife. Perhaps this follows from the popular notion in evangelical youth culture that men are sexual beings without much feeling, and women are emotional beings without much sexuality. There is a sense then that if men engage in sex before marriage, there is more grace for their actions because they're told they're biologically wired to desire sex above all else. Women, however, have much more to lose. If they engage in sex before marriage, they are used up, damaged goods, ruined. And I don't know about you, but I've spent pretty much since I could walk, I've been in Christian education. So I've heard that in a variety of formats a lot over the years. This idea that like boys want sex and girls want feelings. It seems like a wildly simplistic way to understand a human person. I even had a teacher once address a class by saying, you know, like guys just have like a stronger physical attraction and girls are just really looking for someone to woo them. And I just wanted to be like, have you ever like met a woman or like a man for that matter? And for about 2 seconds, I thought about raising my hand and being like, but girls are sexual too. But I realized that if I said that, I would immediately be pegged as a slut. And so I just looked down at my notebook, and we continued in this very uncomfortable lecture, and I said nothing. Men and women are different. Spoiler alert. But we're both human, which means we are both wired for emotional connection, community, and relationship. And we are both wired with a desire for sexual intimacy. And this either-or logic denies us the breadth of our humanity, and it needs to go die.
Come on.
Because the dark implications of this kind of logic particularly break my heart for young men, because it basically just says you guys can't help it. You're human, but when it comes to this area, you're actually like kind of more like animals because you're lacking self-control, and like, don't worry, no one expects anything different from you anyway. And you need to start, guys, you need to start getting offended by statements like that. You are fully human, made in the image of God, with the need for relationships, emotional health, and community, and you are not animals. I have too many truly excellent men in my life to believe things like that. And so when people say things like, boys will be boys, ask yourself, could this sentence easily be replaced with boys will be terrible? Because that's generally what people are saying. And girls, you have a body, you are in possession of a sexuality, and having sexual desires does not make you a freak, it means you have a pulse. You don't need to be afraid or ashamed of those things. And I think because we've separated men and women into these neat and tidy categories, specifically when it comes to porn, guys don't talk about it, girls definitely don't talk about it. Because they're not supposed to have sexual desires in the first place, right? So if they look at porn, then they just must be freaks. They just must be monsters. And if you're here tonight and that is your struggle, for the love of all things good and holy and true, please know that you are not a freak or a monster, and you are definitely not alone. And John and his team have put together some truly excellent resources. I was perusing the website just yesterday. There are some great things for you to read and people for you to get connected with. So I would echo Jeff in saying, do not leave here with secrets, because you will find that you are not alone. So back to the language and metaphors of purity. Richard Beck is the chair of psychology at Abilene Christian University, and he writes about how we use purity as a metaphor and says this: most sins don't get the purity metaphor. Most sins are framed metaphorically as mistakes or errors, as performance failures. What is important to note about these is that they aren't catastrophic in nature. They can be easily rehabilitated. If you make a mistake, you try again. If you stumble and fall, you get back up. Inherent in the logic of the metaphor is an obvious route to rehabilitation. But not so with the purity metaphor. When the sin is framed as a purity violation, the damage that is done is total and unable to be rehabilitated. A purity violation creates a state of irreversible ruin. We've put this in a special category of its own, and on it we have hung all of a person's hopes for their future or for their future relationships, and the results have been nothing short of catastrophic. Another researcher who works closely with young evangelicals says this: one of the things I started noticing about 10 years ago was that I was seeing more and more amounts of sexual shame, of religious sexual shame, horrendous amounts. The self-loathing that people were feeling and describing about themselves really paralleled the kind of self-loathing that you often see with someone who's experienced childhood sexual assault. Just let that sink in for a second. I'm not saying that people who aren't Christians don't wrestle with issues of sexuality, but the ways that we've framed it and the consequences that we've said this sin has resulted in our shame levels being through the roof. We have a problem on our hands. But this is not the part where I'm like, just go out and have sex because it's not a big deal and there aren't any consequences. I don't believe that to be true. I deeply believe now more than ever that sexual intimacy is desired for the love and commitment of marriage. But what I am saying is that we need to take a good, long, hard look at the ways that we've been talking about this and the ways that we've been thinking about it. Because our current framework is extremely damaging and doesn't actually reflect why we're called to sexual holiness in the first place. So a few months after I started wrestling with this, I was taking Sociology of Gender with LaDawn Johnson. Has anyone ever taken that class? Well, get on it. Are any of you Soc majors? There it is, our one Soc major. Thank you for being here. So I was sitting down in this class and we were about to start a lecture on sexuality when LaDawn says, in this no-nonsense way that only LaDawn can communicate, she says, listen, your virginity is not about your future spouse. It is not a gift that you are waiting to give away. Abstaining outside of marriage is about your whole life, sexuality included, being submitted to Christ in loving obedience. This practice is about your discipleship, not some hypothetical future someone. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have been in Christian education for 21 years, and I can't believe it is my last semester at Biola. Like, it was almost comical. It is my very last semester, and someone just bothered to tell me this. Like, this is a game changer. I think I had to, leave class. I was like, I gotta go think about this. Sorry, I'm not gonna be able to stay for the rest of the lecture. Like, that makes so much more sense, right? Your virginal state, or lack thereof, is not an object that you are waiting to give to some hypothetical future someone, because, spoiler, the Bible's not great about telling you about this, but there might not be someone in the future, and I don't mean that as a bummer, but it's an incomplete way to view our sexuality, right? If it's always about this person in the future. We seek to honor God with our sexuality as a part of our discipleship for our whole lives, including if and when you ever get married. You're still going to have to be a prayerful, thoughtful, considerate person who stewards their sexuality well. Can we stop treating marriage like this finish line where you're like, woo, I made it, and now I never have to talk to God about this ever again. That's actually probably the worst thing that you could do when you get married. This way of thinking is big enough for all of us. Whether you are single or dating or married, whether you are straight or same-sex attracted, this framework's goal is not another person. This framework's goal is Jesus, making us more like him and urging us to steward our sexuality for his glory. I really like the way Rachel Held Evans describes it. She says this: Perhaps instead of virginity or even purity, which carries something of an either-or connotation, we ought to talk about the path of holiness. Holiness to me means committing every area of my life, from sex to food to work to time to the lordship of Jesus. It means asking how I might love God and love my neighbors in those areas so that the Spirit can grow love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in the sacred soil of everyday life. Holiness isn't about sticking to a list of goals. It isn't something you either have or don't have, you keep or you lose. It's a way of life filled with twists and turns, mistakes and growth, uncertainty and reward. And I really could not agree more with Jeff's point about your life and your discipleship not being linear. And so much of your life is linear right now. You have a trajectory, right? You're in college, you just registered for classes, like you know the way that your life is going. And it is a real hard awakening when you graduate and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore or who I am. And so, or like one of my friends told me. No, I'm just kidding. Postgrad is hard, I don't miss. Anyway, I went off topic there for a hot second. Understanding that your life is not linear, your relationships are not linear, the areas in which you need to heal and grow are not linear, like that could not be a more important lesson. Anyway. So the aim of purity culture, right, is to keep Christians, young Christians, from having sex before they're married. Jonathan Fincher once tweeted, too often the aim of our youth groups is to produce sober virgins, and we need to start aiming higher than that. Because a lot of, that's funny, because a lot of people get to their wedding days as virgins because they don't want to be damaged goods, right? Not because they understood their sexuality as a means, as a way for the Holy Spirit to meet them and to help them be formed more into Christ-likeness, right? Because we can obey all kinds of rules and still not be like Jesus. You could kick your porn habit, never watch another minute of it, and still not be like Jesus. The Pharisees loved to come to him and quiz him about specifics of the law, but Jesus is constantly drawing them back to the attitudes of their hearts from which their actions will necessarily flow. What makes us like Christ is having hearts that long to see and treat others as image bearers of God, longing to love them better than we love ourselves. You could never watch porn again, and you could make it to marriage and have never touched someone of the opposite sex. But if you fail to recognize the image of God in the people around you, you have wildly missed the point. So yes, regard sexual intimacy as something to be shared in covenant with a spouse. But don't do it because you're terrified of becoming damaged goods. Do it out of love for Christ, and so that the Spirit can have his way in your heart and produce in you everything that you need for life and for godliness. Regard it as an area where you can grow in your love for God, for others, and for yourself. And I'm convinced that a major way that we need to love other people better in this conversation is that we have to start challenging the ever-popular youth group object lesson. Romans 12:2, Paul writes this, "Be no longer conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I know that this conference specifically is addressing how we need to be renewed and transformed in the ways I'm going to start that sentence over. We're not going to be conformed to the world and its consumption of porn, right? But this is another way that we need to be transformed, is we need to stop treating or talking about people's bodies like they're objects, right? Because that's what we're doing when we're comparing them to lollipops or apples or Scotch tape. Mm-hmm. Porn is objectification, but so is that analogy. Mm-hmm. Sarah Gallo, in a piece for Relevant Magazine, describes it this way. She talks using the language of women and girls, but I would also say that men are included in this as well. By using metaphors that objectify women and girls, we are following the examples set by larger society. We may not be plastering up images of Victoria's Secret models, but we are placing the bodies of girls, and with that, the value of their virginity, onto a pedestal. We are reducing women to objects which may be used and disposed of when their value declines. By a youth pastor telling a group of girls that their value is less because of sex, much like a chewed up piece of gum, that individual is guilty of objectifying women and following in the steps of the world. When we reduce women to disposable objects, we are diminishing their humanity. We are taking away their individual will by comparing them to inanimate objects without power. When we, as members of the church, use these reductive object lessons, we are participating in and enabling a destructive culture against the bodies of girls and women. So I don't have all the answers about this subject. I say that as if I will one day, but that's never going to happen either. I'm on a journey, and I'm still learning. This all started with a friend for me, and in the community that Jeff talks about, the kind that I was so lucky to find at Biola, these people who I could draw near to and tell them the things I was most ashamed of. I'm still reading and talking about this, to anyone who will listen to me. Thanks, John, for inviting me. And pretty much the only thing I'm sure of at this point is that this subject is a lot more difficult and complex and ultimately beautiful than what signing a 3x5 card when we were 14 led us to believe.
Yeah.
But this journey doesn't need to be terrifying, and it does not need to be shame-filled. And so if you're sitting here tonight and you've internalized some of these messages that you're an object, or that you're gross, or that you're dirty or broken, my prayer is that the Spirit of God would do what he does best and meet you where you are, in the midst of your questions and your doubts and your fears, and restore to you a knowledge of your worth. May you begin the process of breaking free from the lies of the enemy with love to hold you captive, and walk in the truth of your belovedness and your intrinsic value. May you be transformed from the inside out. As the Apostle John writes, may your lives be formed fully by love rather than fear. And may you be brave enough to let other people in. May you surround yourself with those who will love you well and speak the truth loudly and frequently over your life. Dr. Tina Sellers, who specializes in the integration of sexuality and spirituality, says this: when we continue to shroud sexuality in silence, we continue to burden faith-filled children and young adults with a deep shame that interrupts their ability to fully know God's love and grace. Shame modulates distance and intimacy and sexual expression of God's active love. When people are filled with shame and self-loathing, their affected self-esteem takes precedence in their interactions with others. In essence, sexuality encased in silence and shame keeps people from intimately knowing both God and each other, and cripples our ability as a community of believers to truly love and be a healing force in our hurting world. And last time I checked, that was our mission statement, wasn't it? To impact the world for the Lord Jesus Christ, to be that healing force. So let's do that by reshaping this conversation, by committing to view each person we meet with a holy reverence, acknowledging them to be a beloved child of God, not objects, not goods, damaged or otherwise. And let us remember and proclaim that it has never ever been our behavior that makes us pure, but an acknowledgement of who Jesus is and of his purity that compels us to walk in the way everlasting. Let's pray.